Well, good afternoon. Welcome to MOS Live. My name is Megan and my pronouns are she and hers, and I am excited to be live with you today. We have a really interesting presentation for you. We'll be asking the question, can computers learn to see? And so what if they can? And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a chance for you to ask some of your own questions. And if you're joining us here on Zoom, you can start asking questions at any time by using the Q&A button on your screen. If you'd like to see captions, you can access those by clicking the CC button and selecting Show Subtitles. Now, if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, unfortunately, we cannot see your questions during the show, but we are thrilled that you're tuning in. So let's get started with a little game, and I am going to invite my colleague, Meg, to come on and help me out.
Hello. Hi.
All right, so we're going to play a little game, and I'm going to show some pictures, and I'm going to ask if you can tell us if you think this picture that I show is of a Chihuahua or a blueberry muffin.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, here we go.
Oh,
First picture.
that is a Chihuahua.
I think so too. Very good. Okay. How about this one?
That one is a blueberry muffin.
Yes, it looks like a blueberry muffin to me. I see some muffininess and some blueberries. All right, here's a couple more. How about this one?
It's a Chihuahua.
Very good. I see some eyes and a nose, some whiskers. I'm thinking Chihuahua. All right, and last one.
This one is a muffin.
Great. Thank you so much. There is no fooling you. You got it. This one is slightly reminiscent of a Chihuahua, but still a muffin. All right. Thank you so much, Meg. We'll see Meg again at the end of the presentation to help us out with the Q&A. Thanks, Meg.
See you soon.
All right. Well, great job. You may have been playing along with us. And we humans are pretty good at telling the difference between objects, even when they look somewhat alike, like these dogs and muffins. So even when they're sort of the same color and the blueberries sort of remind us of maybe eyes and a nose, well, we're not easily fooled into thinking that a dog is a muffin or one of these muffins is actually a dog. And the same is true for things like barn owls and apples, or even parrots and guacamole. Now, I can kind of see the similarity here, but I'm not going to easily mistake a parrot for some guacamole. But let's go back to dogs and muffins for a minute. Now, here's a picture of a person holding a blueberry muffin in a plastic bag, and it kind of looks like the dog that they have standing there next to it. But again, most humans can easily tell the difference between that muffin inside the bag and the dog standing next to it. Well, let's see how a computer does with this. Now, Microsoft has a program called CaptionBot, and you can try this at home with your own photos. So when we uploaded this photo of the dog and the muffin to CaptionBot, the computer got a little confused. It replies, I think it's a hand holding a dog. But we know that the hand is actually holding the muffin, not the dog. And recognizing images is something that actually seems really easy to us, but getting a computer to do it is not so easy. Well, why? Well, let's start by investigating what happens in your brain when you view a photo of a dog. Now, first of all, special cells that make up the retina at the back of your eye, they absorb all the light coming from the different parts of the image. And right away, that light starts to be processed by each little patch of cells. And for each part of the image, the cells report whether there are light or dark areas, colors, or is anything maybe changing over time. And that information is then sent along the optic nerve to a gateway region in the middle of the brain that decides, based on all the inputs your brain is getting, what to send to the main visual processing region all the way at the back of the brain. And this is called the primary visual cortex. And once it arrives at the primary visual cortex, different clusters of specialized cells process the information in steps, adding new information and then passing it along. First, one region of cells looks to see if any of the light or dark spots actually make up edges of different orientations. Then another region looks at those edges to see where they meet to make angles. Yet another region of cells takes those angles and sees how they fit together into shapes. And as the image goes through these steps, the brain builds up a more and more detailed image or idea of what it might be looking at. Finally, regions in the temporal lobe start to sort out what category of thing this is, eventually arriving at dog. And this entire processing pathway is called the visual ventral stream, and it only takes a tiny fraction of a second. And it's the reason that we are so good at telling the difference between, for example, dogs and blueberry muffins. All right, so now that we know how we recognize objects, what does this have to do with getting computers to recognize images? Because remember, they're pretty terrible at it, right? Well, just in the past 10 years or so, they've gotten quite a bit better. And that's largely due to something called neural networks. And neural networks are a special kind of artificial intelligence, or AI. And they're really good at learning by example to recognize patterns and solve problems. And as you might have guessed from the name, neural networks are sort of based on how our brains approach this pattern or object recognition process. So, just like how the cells in our eyes broke up the dog photo into little bits, a neural network might take the same dog photo and break it into little sections, just a few pixels at a time. And we'll zoom in on just a few, but imagine the computer is doing this for every single patch of pixels. And we can ask our computer to check this first group of pixels for edges. Nothing too complicated, just lighter and darker areas with a boundary between them. And then repeat this over and over for all of the pixel patches. And when the computer thinks it sees a certain kind of edge, well, that pathway will light up. And it will keep repeating this and lighting up all of those different pathways. And then once we've checked each pixel patch for each different type of edge, we can take all of the information gathered in that round and then feed it into the next one and say, okay, given that these types of edges are present in one region of the image, what shapes and textures can we find? Do we maybe see a circle or a triangle, or do we have a lot of wispy stripes? And then, once we've gathered that layer of information, we can say whether any of these simple shapes maybe add up to more complicated features, like an eye or even a nose. And finally, based on everything we've learned so far, what's the verdict? Is it a dog or is it not a dog? By dividing the image recognition problem up into these different layers, we've built ourselves this really complicated, scary looking diagram full of nodes connected by lines. And this is what neural net diagrams tend to look like. But once you know that all that's going on here is this progression of information gathering from simpler to more complex features, it gets a lot less scary. And by the way, if you've ever heard the term deep learning or references to something called a deep neural network, well, this is exactly what that means. Lots of intermediate layers breaking down the problem and getting and gathering information at each step, building up from the simplest layer up to the most complex. All right, but here's the thing. The first time we point our brand new neural network at our dog photo, it's not going to do very well. In fact, it has no idea what it's looking at and pretty much guesses at random. But that's okay. Here's the exciting part. Once we have the answer, well, since we have the answer, that is, we know that it's a dog, we know when the computer gets it wrong. And when it does get it wrong, then a very important thing happens. A wrong alert is sent backwards through the network, and all of the little decisions that added up to that wrong answer can be corrected for the next time around. And so, by showing lots and lots of examples of photos of dogs, all kinds of dogs, and correcting the neural network every time it gets the wrong answer, we can train our neural network to get better and better at getting the right answer. The pathways that lead to the right answer get stronger over this training period, and the other pathways get weaker. The neural network teaches itself what is and is not a dog. And each of these little nodes in our network is acting sort of like the cells in our brains, or neurons. Each node or neuron is gathering information from the previous nodes and then passing it along. In fact, new discoveries about how our brains process the things we see are helping researchers to improve the performance of artificial neural networks all the time. Now, for example, what if in this photo of the dog were mostly covered up by a bush? Well, humans can probably still figure out that there's a dog back there, but how do we do that? Well, we know that there are all kinds of feedback loops, connections that go back and forth between the brain areas that take whatever bits of information we have and use it to build up a better and better guess at what we're looking at. Now, by adding similar feedback loops to neural networks, scientists have improved computer vision programs by leaps and bounds. So, computers really are learning to see better. But what is that good for? Well, for one thing, there are all sorts of things like smart camera applications and all kinds of applications of these neural networks. Now, one of the applications of neural networks that was in the news a lot this year is a program called AlphaFold from a company called DeepMind. Now, AlphaFold is an artificial intelligence program that can figure out how molecules called proteins are shaped. And this is really, really important because proteins are one of the most abundant molecules that make up living things. And they have loads of different functions, like in the structure of our cells, our muscles, enzymes and hormones, and all sorts of stuff. So let's take a little deeper look to find out why this AlphaFold neural network was so important. Well, proteins are made up of chains of chemicals called amino acids. But unlike the string of beads in this model, proteins don't exist in nice straight strands. The chemical interactions between the amino acids, well, they cause the proteins to fold into these really complex, twisted structures. And the ability of a protein to function or do its job depends on its twisty, folded 3D shape. So, understanding how proteins fold is really important for things like understanding certain diseases. The problem is that proteins are really, 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 really small. We can't easily look at them with a microscope. And it's hard to predict how a protein will fold or twist because there are so many different possibilities. Now, there are some laboratory techniques that can be used to solve a protein structure and figure out what it looks like, but they can be really time consuming. So far, scientists have only been able to solve the structures of a small fraction, less than 1% of the 200 million known proteins. And this persistent protein puzzle is called the protein folding problem. And this is where AlphaFold comes in. AlphaFold uses neural networks to figure out what proteins look like based on the sequence of amino acids that make up the protein. In order to get this program to work, scientists trained AlphaFold using over 100,000 examples of known protein structures. And this year, AlphaFold passed some really tough tests, and scientists now think it could be a huge leap forward in solving this protein folding problem, and it could help us make big advances in biology and medicine. Now, the success of AlphaFold was a particularly huge breakthrough, not just in the world of artificial intelligence, but in science in general. You may have seen it on our top 10 science stories of 2020. But there are a lot more cool applications of neural networks and computer vision that have come about recently. Like this project that uses neural networks to distinguish between different birds, which can help scientists track their populations and aid in conservation efforts. And robots can use real time computer vision to perform search and rescue missions in dangerous areas. And neural networks are being used in healthcare screenings and are already starting to help human doctors diagnose diseases earlier and more accurately. And of course, we've all been hearing about advances and setbacks in developing self driving cars. There are a lot of issues, and autonomous vehicles, oops, and autonomous vehicles being tested today are still very far from being able to grapple with unexpected scenarios like people jaywalking, other vehicles behaving erratically, or even just a traffic cop redirecting drivers. There's a really long way to go. And another big problem we're seeing having to do with computer vision is the issue of bias in facial recognition software. For example, when Joy Buolamwini was a graduate student studying artificial intelligence, she discovered that existing facial recognition programs did a really bad job of recognizing her face and the faces of other dark-skinned women, unless she put on a white mask. Now, this discovery led her to create the Algorithmic Justice League, which highlights issues of bias in artificial intelligence. And in 2018, the American Civil Liberties Union released a study showing that Amazon's facial recognition software misidentified 28 current members of Congress as criminals in a mugshot database. Of the Congress people who were identified as criminals, a disproportionate number were people of color. In addition to these thorny safety and ethical issues, computer vision also faces challenges just in terms of how well it can recognize something as simple as a shirt. For example, maybe a computer can recognize a shirt if it looks like this or this, but what if it's on a hanger like this or crumpled on the floor like this? These kinds of programs are only as good as the set of examples they're trained on, and they're a long way yet from being able to deal with the messiness of the real world. Certainly not as well as our amazing brains can. We still have our work cut out for us. But scientists, like those at the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, headquartered at MIT, are hard at work learning more about how humans process really complicated visual information so we can apply that to computers and improve artificial intelligence. And if you're interested in learning more about artificial intelligence and computer vision from the folks who are studying it, you can head over to our YouTube channel, Nano Nerds, where we have a whole bunch of videos to check out and you can learn some more about this topic. All right, well, that concludes the presentation portion of the show. And now we can take some questions from you. So I'm going to invite my colleague Meg back on to help me out with the Q&A portion. Hi, Meg.
Hello.
Let me just stop sharing my screen for the moment. And let's see if we have any questions. Well, I have a question for you, Meg, if you can help us out. In the presentation, I mentioned that there are some medical applications of artificial intelligence. Can you give us an example of that?
I can. So there are, this is being used more and more. It's not so much a substitute for a diagnosis from a doctor, at least not yet, not likely in the near future, but it's more like a check or a pre-screening stage that really helps doctors sift through lots and lots of data. So, for example, I know there's a lot of work being done on breast cancer scans, for example, where you go in for a test, for a scan, to see if there might be a tumor or something wrong that could be detected. But a technician usually has to go through all of those scans and personally identify whether something looks wrong. And that can be really time consuming when there are lots of scans to go through. So the advantage of using a neural network to sort of help out with that is that a lot of that data can be sent to the neural network, which can be trained on lots and lots and lots of these scans from the past. There are so many examples that can show it, like, this looks right and this looks fishy. So you can train a neural network on all of the examples, and then that can really help to send up a red flag before a human looks at it, or to confirm something that a human has also raised red flags about. So that's being used more and more, and I think that is a huge help just in terms of getting early warning signs for these types of things.
Great, thank you. That's so interesting. All right, well, we have another question here. Is artificial intelligence helping with criminal justice and searching for suspects, et cetera, nowadays, or is that only on TV? Oh, that is a really good question. And I know there are some places where people have attempted to use things like facial recognition software for criminal justice. And I know that's one of the places where problems have arisen. And so I know that at least in Boston, facial recognition software is not used. I believe it's been banned because there are just so many problems with it, especially in terms of bias. I know in other countries it may be different. They may be actually using artificial intelligence in criminal justice, and it may be used in other ways, not necessarily facial recognition software. But that's as much as I know. I don't know if you have anything to add, Meg.
Yeah, so I know that somebody just chimed in to ask a follow-up question of why, and I think that's in reference to why was it banned in Boston?
Mhm.
Right, and uh, mostly I believe that has to do with this very serious issue of bias in these programs. So one of the things that Megan mentioned in your presentation, just at the end there, was that these things are only as good as the data sets that they train on. And when you think of the kinds of data that are available, you need a lot of it. So what are the kinds of images that are out there that are available to use for this purpose? And they're usually not very representative of the actual population. So given that that's the case, that means that they just inherit these the biases of the data set that underlies them, which means that they are not as good at recognizing people of color as white people, fairer skinned people. And that means that there can be mistakes that are made, and those mistakes disproportionately affect certain communities. So because of that, because there are many other kinds of ethical concerns with facial recognition, because the stakes are so high to make a mistake like that. Boston, at least for now, has decided to not go down that path. And there's a lot of work being done to figure out, whether we can mitigate these risks or who should be at the table when we have those conversations. And it is a super important part of artificial intelligence conversations going forward.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's a really great point too that the technology behind artificial intelligence is just moving so quickly. And as these tricky situations arise, one of the important things that people are trying to figure out is who is regulating artificial intelligence and deciding when it's okay to use it, and who decides if it's biased or not, is a really important question that people are working on right now. Yeah, those are great questions. Um,
I, Oh, I was just going to say, I see another question here that is a really interesting one, which is, can the computer be set to self-train in recognizing patterns or wrong answers? And the answer is yes. It's way more common to not leave it alone to self-train. The kind of example that Megan ran through, where you are providing a whole bunch of examples and the examples are labeled, that is, like, you send it a whole bunch of images, some of them are dogs, but the ones that are dogs are labeled dog, and the ones that are not are labeled not, so that the training can happen by uh, telling the computer every time that it gets it wrong and sort of back propagating that wrong alert to correct it for next time. But there is also a way, there's also a kind of neural network where you leave them to self-train and sort of develop what they think are, sort of gather what the most important features from this set of examples are without being told ahead of time what to look for. Um, and that is useful for some applications, not so useful for others. The kinds of things that you would normally see in everyday life, like when you use a web browser or when you ask your smart assistant on your phone for help, those have been trained on the vast, vast data set of the internet um, using this kind of indexed or tagged data.
yeah, great. Thank you, Meg. So there was another follow-up question here to Meg, what you were talking about with medical applications for neural networks, asking if those kind of work like CT scans or maybe MRIs. And I believe what's happening is they're using existing CT scans or MRI scans, and using those as the training set. So kind of like what Meg was just describing, and how they actually train these neural networks by giving them lots and lots of examples. They can look at a scan from someone who has no disease, and then give them lots of examples of scans that do have a certain disease, and specifically they're asking about, can it be used to find tumors and things, and yeah, so Meg gave the example of breast cancer as one of the diseases that they're trying to use artificial intelligence for, to help doctors look through all of these scans and try to find early evidence of disease. Another application that they attempted to use artificial intelligence for was diagnosing COVID-19 in lung scans. And so seeing if they could train neural networks to recognize the the difference between a normal scan or a normal type of pneumonia and people who actually had COVID-19. So definitely, those are really great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. I could just do like a quick follow. Nobody asked this question, but just as a follow-up on that labeled versus unlabeled sort of data. One of the concerns with these artificial intelligence in general that you probably heard is, is it going to take over? Is it going to replace us in our jobs? Because computers will just do everything in the future. And just this like tiny piece of an answer to that question is the actual data labeling itself. So what to train the computers on has to be, all those images have to be tagged and understood and then fed to the computer. So actually at the moment, that is a hugely labor intensive process. And it's one that humans are very intimately involved in because of our amazing brains. So for the time being, the answer to that is really no, they are not taking over the world. And there are lots of other examples for why that is not the case. Another one being just how much power it takes to run the kinds of computers that do this training before it's sent out into the world to answer your questions on your phone. But I thought that you might like to know just how much of a human component there still is to sort of, behind the artificial intelligence that we find useful and increasingly useful in our everyday lives.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Meg. Thank you for bringing that up because it's true. And you may hear the term, I think it's sort of like a general or like universal artificial intelligence or something like that, which is not something that we have. There's no computer or robot that can just think and feel for itself the way that humans can. We're a very long way away from that. Which is interesting. We do have all these incredible applications, but it does, like Meg said, it still takes a lot of human power to make these things work. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. Let's see if we have one more question I think we could take quickly. Is artificial intelligence being used in the workforce to help notice issues arising, like watching over instead of humans watching? That is an interesting question, and I don't fully know the answer to that. I know there are some artificial intelligence programs that can monitor people, perhaps when they're working. I don't know how widely used those are. I know there's a lot of ethics issues in those as well. So I think those are some of the questions that people are trying to answer right now, is whether programs that do things like that, or programs that sort of screen employees as they're submitting resumes for jobs and things like that. Those that's a big issue now. How these artificial intelligence programs screen resumes to find out who's going to make it to get an interview for a job or something like that. That's a big issue and something that that people are talking about. So that's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. All right, well, I think that's just about all the time we have. Meg, thank you so much for coming on to help us answer questions. That was
Thanks.
great. I'm going to give you a chance to say goodbye and we will wrap up. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Great questions. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks. Well, we have a whole bunch more going on over at MOS at Home. So please check us out on our website or follow us on social media. You can head over to www.mos.org/MOS at Home to see what we're up to. And if you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting the museum by going to engage.mos.org/welcome. Your contributions will ensure that we can continue providing this programming free of charge and available to everyone at home. All right, well, thank you again so much for your wonderful questions and for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.